So, as the title suggests, I'm here to talk about morality and ethics. What is morality? One of the things that was thought to set us apart as a species was the concept of morality. The idea that we can discern among many possible courses of action and assign them a relative value of right or wrong, good or bad. To do so requires us to have some kind of moral system. One such system is sometimes referred to as moral objectivism or objective morality. This is the idea that there is one cohesive moral truth, sometimes assumed to come from a deity. It's a static set of rules that is thought to be true for everyone, everywhere, and be unchanging. It is reflected in formal codes such as a Charter of Rights or in biblical texts, or in semi-formal codes governed by popular thought and enacted by social pressure, i.e. common sense. It's my contention that most people tend towards the latter of these, the so-called common sense, even if they claim to follow the former. Subjective morality, or moral relativism, on the other hand, suggests that there is no moral authority or ultimate truth in the universe, and that morality is strictly a human concern. It recognizes that different people do ethics differently. However, it does not necessarily argue that all opinions are equal, just that we are on our own to find out what's right. How can morality be subjective, one might ask? What's to keep us from sliding into utter chaos? Sorry. The subtle presumption here is that chaos is our natural state, and that without moral authority, society would become completely unhinged. I could probably spend my entire talk on this side point, but I think it's been argued well enough by others that neither camp has the exclusive on good behavior or exemption from bad behavior. However, a point of contention remains. Just how do we decide what's right or wrong if it's completely subjective? How can one person say to another, I believe that your views are clearly wrong, without appealing to our own subjective frame of view? Well, I don't think it's entirely subjective. I think that part of the answer lies in our underlying values and perspectives. Just as an example, a value might be something like, harming others for personal gain is wrong, or human life and well-being are precious. Theoretically, if we could share exactly the same values and have precisely the same perspective on what things like well-being and harm mean, and perhaps the omniscience to comprehend it all, I think we could rationally discern some actions as ethical and others as unethical. Does this action serve this value or go against it? You would then have an objective morality within well-defined parameters. Great, so we just have to get everyone on the same page. I'll call the meeting. Jen, you call, I don't know, the Pope or something. And if you could call Prime Minister. Wait a sec, don't call him. Anyway, we just need to get everyone together and hash it all out. Wait a sec, how do we decide which values are good to begin with? Well, I guess that's kind of subjective. Back to square one. It seems to me that if you work any complex ethical situation down to a basic objection or value, like harming others for personal gain is wrong, one still has to ask, well, why? Because. Well, I guess that won't do. How about empathy? Why empathy? Well, we feel it because we evolved to. We evolved to because it allowed for our survival. In short, it works. Further up our evolutionary timeline, pressures were likely such that our predecessors benefited from coming together socially to overcome them. As we continued to do so, we would have needed ways of promoting cohesion and internal stability. And from this, a basic ability to empathize was likely born. We developed systems of social interaction, like social software running on individual nodes of biological hardware, interdependently evolving through development of higher cognition and networks of language. Only then could we have hoped to describe a moral code. If I had to guess, I would say that a simple sense, or that a simple moral sense, was likely present long before any formal code, simple as it may have been. And yet, systems of evolution are not necessarily perfection makers. To keep with a computer analogy, sometimes it's like spaghetti code. Whatever solution happens to come along first gets thrown into the final product and carried forward, no matter how kludgy or problematic it might become down the road. This is how I view our current pervasive common sense view of morality. What's more important to me than simply knowing what right and wrong look like is how these systems lead us to behave. The so-called objective morality tends to coincide with a simplistic framework of punishment and reward. Reward the good and punish the bad. At best, this is a simplistic presumption that everything can be controlled by incentives or disincentives. At extremes, often marked by religious ideology, the proponents of this morality do not just naively presume that punishment has a corrective influence over behavior, but that punishment is itself the correction. For the wages of sin is death, says Romans 6:23. It is the physics of moral conversation. For every transgression, there's an equal and opposite punishment. Case in point, if you still find yourself advocating for punishment on the grounds of, well, they deserve it, then you are still thinking in these terms. The problem is not that punishment never works. It's that there's no consideration of ultimate causes. To ask whether it's working seems more like an afterthought, or is even met with hostility. If it comes back to bite us, we simply conclude that we didn't punish them hard enough, a classic case of self-sustaining dogma. It also lends itself to dualism and binary thinking. Dualism being the binary separation of everything into either good or bad. Our other binaries are like smart or stupid, correct or errant, contributing or freeloading, thoughtfulness or being oversensitive, legitimate or illegitimate, you're with us or against us. In this kind of framework, it becomes very hard to listen to any kind of criticism of our own actions. There is far too much at stake. There is no separation between action and actor. If my actions are wrong, I am wrong. There's no room for error or fault, and we must fight tooth and nail to preserve our status at the positive end of these binary scales. Inversely, character or intention can become an easy cop-out. If I can argue that my intention was not malicious, then moral equilibrium is maintained. I have no restitution to make, and certainly no impetus to reform my perspective. There may be social patterns, decades or even centuries old, which isolate and oppress entire demographics of people, and which no longer require any ill intention or even awareness on my part. But that's okay. I didn't start it, not my fault. Most importantly, this model of morality does not reflect anything we currently know about human nature. It views the human being as a simple moral actor, acting solely from the nature of its character. If you remember Jem's talk from last year, it implies a strict free will process of decision-making, free from causation. There was an excellent talk given by Matthew Taylor of the RSA entitled Changing Minds, Preparing for an Era of Neurological Reflexivity. I'm assigning this to you as homework. The test is next week. In it, he references many sources, including Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment and Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, both of which speak to the idea that a person's behavior has more to do with context and external influences and less to do with character. Amongst a laundry list of cognitive shortcomings of the human mind, most notably those which relate to how we perceive our own consciousness, Matthew Taylor has this to say: instead of a self that polices the boundaries of the inner me and the outside world, the reality is that our minds are embedded as unique nodes in a complex web of external stimuli. Much like the gradual evolution of single-celled organisms into collective systems called animals, we join together in a system called a society, one of which has exploded in size, complexity, and interconnectivity. We need to have a much broader understanding of the complex intersections taking place at the individual, if we are to tackle social problems that we are now faced with? I don't have a lot of answers, but it seems to me that too many of us are not even asking the right questions. Questions like, why are people doing what they're doing, and how can we help them? Instead of, how can we lock them away, forget about them, and pretend that it's problem solved? There's another line of thought on morality which makes more sense to me. It's called consequentialism. It's the basic idea that the rightness of our actions is determined by their ultimate outcome. This at least seems like a step in the right direction. And I'll end with a quote. As Einstein said, we can't solve problems using the same kinds of thinking that we used when we created them. I'm just going to grab a drink.
Any questions?
Nothing?
We're all secretly immoral.
We agree.
Right on.
So is it better to think of morality as a cause or an effect? In terms of...
Without expounding on that, I would say neither.
Just to elaborate, in terms of, I guess a lot of us think morality, our morals drive our actions, when really our morals are the sum, I think our morals are the sum total of our actions. And in the sense that we've evolved in such a way, whether through genetics or cultural wars, and certain things that have been successful have obviously outlasted certain patterns of behavior that weren't successful. And the successful ones have become our morals in a sense,
Right.
because they work. Not to say that they're necessarily the best, but they work.
Right.
Is that a reasonable way to be thinking of morality, or is that a shortcut? Or?
Well, to answer your first question, now that you've elaborated a bit, I would say both. I would say it's both a cause and an effect in that sense. If I could remember Jim's phrasing from his speech, the effect of past causes and the cause of future effects, which I think pretty much describes everything in our universe. But and sorry, what's the second question? Is that like to describe it in sort of?
I'm saying we have. Is it fair to describe morals as the consequences of successful behaviors? And by successful, I don't mean necessarily behaviors that make us feel good, but just you talk about sort of our cohesiveness as societies that have developed. Societies that were the most cohesive tended to produce the most offspring, perhaps, and those offspring tended to produce the most offspring. And the ones who had behaviors that were more likely to lead to successful offspring, whether it came through genetics or cultural wars, were the ones that persisted and become what we call morality.
So you're asking, is it basically a system of evolution in a sense? I would say,
yeah. Even if I'm not talking specifically genetic evolution, but the things we say are moral, like it's not good to kill people, or it's good to be kind to other people, and to have some reasonable balance of altruism and sociopathy. That works, and that's how we define our morals.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it all kind of evolves together, both the good and the bad. Right? So, not sure if I've answered that adequately, but I didn't.
You mentioned consequentialism at the end of your talk, and I am attracted to a lot of the principles of consequentialism. And I remember something that I think the first person who said it to me was Annalena Sheng, who spoke last year. The way she phrased it, and she didn't come up as far as I know, is intentions aren't magic. So just because you didn't intend to cause somebody harm, that doesn't sort of free you from all responsibility. If you decide to drink a whole bunch and then get into your car and drive and you hit somebody, you didn't intend to hurt somebody, but you're still in a lot of ways very culpable for what happened.
Right.
So consequentialism sort of frees us from that exculpation. But on the other hand, isn't it important that we consider intentions a little bit? Or are they completely irrelevant?
I wouldn't say they're completely irrelevant. I think they're definitely the driving force in promoting good behavior. I think a lot of the, I guess, sort of detractors to consequentialism or sort of that intent-based argument is that, well, I can never not do wrong. Like I have limited awareness and I'm going to screw up, so I don't like that.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of missing the point, that it's okay that we screw up once in a while, and that
Right.
being completely reticent to ever make a mistake comes from that strict morality, where you can't ever do wrong. I'm not sure who's up first, but Ari?
So pretty much what you're saying then is that it's impact, not intent, but intentions are more, oftentimes intentions are used as an excuse when instead they should be used as an explanation.
Right.
You didn't, and it's not really for the value of what you did, it's more for the value of the after effect that it will be possible to trust you again, as opposed to just writing you off as having no regard for anything.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to add one more thing, because I mean, we've talked about the consequences of an action. We talked about the intent of the action. What about the action itself? I mean, somebody could have perfectly good intentions. They want to help a woman or somebody who's in an abusive situation, and they go about that by killing the abuser. End result is that the situation is taken care of, but was that really ethical? That's my problem with consequentialism, I guess, is that it almost sounds like ends justify the means a little bit.
Well, it depends on your sense of morality, and I guess the culture around you as well.
Can you make an argument that there's an absolute morality? Is there a sense of morality?
Sorry?
Is there a sense of morality? Is morality, can you have
We
a
all
sense?
have a moral sense, I suppose.
But is there an absolute, like, are there things we can say are absolutely immoral? Are there things that we can say are absolutely...
I think a lot of that would depend on how specific you are. I mean, thou shalt not kill. I don't think that is a statement. That's an absolute statement, but obviously everybody will admit to certain circumstances in which killing is the morally preferable choice. I think just about everybody could come up with some weird scenario involving, trains on tracks and people tied to them. So I think maybe that depends on what you mean by objective.
Yeah, what you're describing is something that I would look at as an objective morality sort of position. Is there an absolute truth around it? And I think what I'm advocating for is that, I'm not advocating for necessarily, just saying that the way I see it is that we come up with it. We pretty much have to agree together on some level what's right and wrong. And what's important is the hashing out and the discussion about it. Go ahead.
This idea that it should be based on consequence seems to go against the idea of a conscience and the idea of legally sane, knowing the difference between right and wrong. I mean, the idea is that we have a conscience and we innately know what's the difference between right and wrong. We don't go and project what the consequences is going to be and make a value judgment. Well, if I do this and they're going to be this consequence. The idea of a conscience is that you inherently know the difference without even going through a sequence of cause and events that determine the consequence. You somehow know what's right and wrong through your conscience. And if you don't know this, you're legally insane. So it's very ingrained in us that we have this ability to distinguish between right and wrong without going through any kind of long analysis of consequence. That it's completely divorced from that.
I think when you say consequence, I'm interpreting that as having a moral sense. And I think, I don't think that's adequate. I think we actually have to have discussion about morality on more complex issues.
People, when you make moral judgments in your head or your conscience,
But
you're not discussing with anybody.
But you're not born with that innate sense. It's something you learn through culture, what you think is right or wrong. Because there's a lot of things like, let's say, slavery, where right now to us it seems like a morally obvious, no consequence decision that slavery is wrong. But in the past, people had different views, and that doesn't mean they. Well, I would say they were wrong about their views. I don't want to say they're not right or wrong, but it's how you did it. culture definitely affected their opinions. It wasn't just out of nowhere they decided that.
But there's lots of studies that show infants can distinguish between right and wrong without any cultural influence. At a very young age, they can distinguish altruism, and that they don't need this. And the idea that slavery, I mean, in some cultures, there's another argument that people always know that slavery is wrong. They just do it anyway because it benefits them. I mean, that when in the 18th century, when there was slavery there was all kinds of people who knew it was wrong and admitted it was wrong and talked about it being wrong. It wasn't, it's not as if culture imposed upon them an
I think we're
idea
going to
that
take the
suddenly
next
it's
question.
right.
Sorry.
People knew this.
Go ahead.
So,
You're saying that, if I understand you correctly, you're saying that the way to come to some sort of moral consensus is to hash things out, sort of in general discussions.
Yeah.
What sort of things do you think can lend insight to actually sort of effective hashing out that can actually lead to, I mean, you have examples from history where you can say, okay, here's some insight where a greater group, I don't know, something like the Nuremberg trials or something like slavery where people said, okay, here's something that happened, this is pretty bad, we shouldn't do this anymore, we should establish laws against it. Like, what kind of things can actually allow a society insight into itself, besides just, I mean, to say consequences almost seems to presuppose that you already have an idea of something being wrong, because if you find out that it was wrong after the fact, you kind of should have thought it was wrong before.
Well, I think it starts with agreeing on some simple guidelines, like simple values,
Right.
and gathering information like statistics or anything in your disposal, and comparing it. Look at the effects and discern as best you can. Does it match this value?
I mean,
Does it
what
go
if you
against
think
it?
that genocide is a good thing?
What's that?
I mean, what if you have a group of people that thinks that genocide is a good thing? Like,
Get a bigger group of people.
Sample size is too small.
Sample size is too small.
Actually, yes.
You need to listen. You need to listen to the other perspectives to gain a greater understanding of why they're coming from this position.
but I listen to those people and I say, well, no, I don't agree with you.
Yeah.
Well, and then you use the various tools of various sort of
But they're already dead.
But not talking about genocide, but most genocides were performed by large groups of people, vast majority of whom were not sociopaths. They were people who had some sort of moral compass that was sort of miscalibrated in a way that allowed them to participate knowingly in a genocide and still think they were good people. Most of the people who were, you name your genocide, whichever one it is, most of the perpetrators, and maybe even someone at the top was a sociopath, but most of the actual perpetrators who did the nuts and bolts were not. And they were, and in their culture, however it was, it came to be known that that kind of behavior was acceptable and, if you will, moral. And
Just like Zimbardo's study.
well, yeah, and so like you mentioned it being contextual in the context of 1930s Germany or 1920s Ukraine or whatever, or 1840s North America when we were, when we were eradicating the native peoples here. Those were moral acts, and we recognize them now as not being moral acts, but it's easy to see how we could go that way again. There's nothing inherently changing about how our brains are wired.
All the more reason to engage in the discussion, I think.
I've got a couple points. You mentioned at the very beginning moral standing being, or moral sense, as you said, being the difference between chaos and any sort of structure. But don't you feel that's kind of an illusion in itself, that we exist in chaos and the moral compass, as you will, help us navigate it? Because the morality is completely relative, as we've pointed out, that the people who are perpetrating a lot of things that we would call immoral, given their cultural influences, their societal influences, maybe the influences at the time, their class influences, or whether or not they're viewed as being a secondhand citizen or anything like that, they believe that their actions are justified if they're not sociopathic. So whatever it is, they're justifying in their morals to do their actions even though someone else sees it as wrong. So it's completely relative. So when you say hash it out, that sounds kind of like everyone's sitting down and making a compromise. So we'll give you hate jokes if you let me walk around with my fly down. Oh, you want to commit genocide on a race of people that isn't here? well, I'm okay with that if it doesn't infringe on my people that I represent. Like, it seems like, where's the morality of it? And then, as was pointed out, if somebody disagrees with someone else's morals to a point of feeling morally superior, well, they just feel they're helping them by committing said genocide. So, is it really a matter of there is any sort of structure that can be put to it? Because in the end, it's kind of relative, and we shouldn't even be doing it for a sense of consequences. Oh, if I kill someone, I'll go to jail. No, if I kill someone and get caught, I'll go to jail. So it should be a matter of, I don't want to steal from the store, I don't want to kill people, I don't want to do bad things,
Right.
because then I feel like I'm a bad person, and that's not cool. And I want to, like, shouldn't it be, we take our own morals and we don't do bad things simply because we want to feel good about our actions?
Well, I think we don't do bad things because we don't do bad things for the most part.
Well, in the end, we're kind of infallible in that we're not
Yeah.
going to do bad things because we're not going to do things we perceive as bad.
Well, consequentialism can't address that, though. I mean, if it's wrong to kill somebody because they're dead, and them being dead is a consequence of you killing them.
Yeah, but then why? Well, using consequences as a reason not to do something, like you go to jail or you get killed as well. That only happens if you get caught, and so the flaw isn't in actually committing the action; it's that you didn't leave a hard enough to find trail, kind of. So, like, isn't it completely relative?
Well,
That's who defines the consequence.
So the question and answer thing has kind of broken down here, so maybe we can continue.